Paradox today. So the end of the book of Exodus, where we are, is devoted to the creation of the first Jewish religious institution. It's called the Mishkan in Hebrew, from the word shachen, meaning to dwell, to live someplace. In English, it's called the tabernacle. Tabernacle is a crazy word. It sounds like a dermatological disease, you know? I got a mosquito bite and it turned into a bad case of tabernacles, right? Well, you smear a little cortisone and in a week it goes away. But the tabernacle is the shrine that the Israelites create in the desert that will then be transferred eventually to the Holy Temple of Jerusalem. And the tradition always associated these things. You'll see that in the Haftarah. Neil, could you do me a favor? We need some chairs, so maybe go get one of the maintenance crews to bring us a few chairs. And everybody could smoosh over and make a room for these lovely people. You shouldn't stand while a rabbi talks so you could fall and hurt yourself. Okay, here we go. Thank you all, you're wonderful. Thanks so much. So the Mishkan becomes the core of the Holy Temple of Jerusalem. You'll see that in the Haftarah. And the question then is going to be, what does it mean to create an institution, a religious institution? The whole Torah portion it's really created for people who like to read Architectural Digest. If you like Architectural Digest, and for you the kind of granite on countertops and wood facing and doors and windows, you'll love this Torah portion, right? There's a whole TV channel that my wife obsessively watches of home decorating television, you know, and people spend all this time, hours agonizing over the kind of bathroom fixtures they're going to put in. And if you're that kind of person, you're going to love this Kriya because God gives Moses exquisite detail about how he wants his Mishkan built. And then next week, you get to do it again, only next week is Fashion Week here in synagogue, right? No, it's true, because next week Tetzaveh is about the garments of the priest. And again, exquisite detail about his gatkas and his socks and his overcoats and his undercoats, gervais. And it's this whole thing. And then you'll see that we take a break for 1 week. Kitisa, we take a break, talk about the golden calf. And then it's repeated all over again in the last two Torah portions because it tells you that Moses did everything God told him to do. So the Torah portion, the Torah takes 4 different weeks of reading to discuss the creation of the Mishkan. 2 weeks to discuss the commandments, and 2 weeks to talk about its execution. Now, to give you some perspective, the whole Exodus story takes place in 4 weeks. Right? Shmot, Vayera, Bo, and Beshalach. We did 4 Torah portions about the Exodus from Egypt. 2 Torah portions about what happens at Mount Sinai, and then 4 Torah portions about the creation and the execution of this Mishkan, which is a way of showing you symmetrically that the Mishkan carries the same importance as the Exodus from Egypt. That it carries a sort of that amount of holiness for the Jewish people, because this is the symbol of God's presence in the world. That's how powerful this is. Now, the whole thing is an answer to one verse. So look at, if you have a Chumash, if you don't, then just listen. But if you do, it's on page 487, chapter 25, verse number 8. Okay? 487. Okay? 487. So God says to Moshe, tell the Israelites to bring me all their valuables. Bring me, whoever would like to donate. This is the first building fund. Anyone who belongs to a shul and says, Girva, why are you always asking for money? The answer is because God said I had to. It says right here, right? Now, 487, look at verse number 8. Okay? In Hebrew, Ve'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. 5 words. In English, let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. Asuli mikdash, make for me a mikdash, a holy spot, a holy place, a sanctuary. Sanctuary from the word sanctify. a sanctuary, a holy place, v'shachanti b'tocham, that I, God, may dwell among the people. Now, the first thing that the commentators will point out is that the sentence is wrong. It should say, v'asuli mikdash, make a sanctuary, v'shachanti b'tocho, I will live in it. But that's not the point. The point of the sanctuary is to allow God to live in the world, to live among us, in our world. This is where religion takes place, in our world. And the sanctuary is going to be this dwelling place for God. Now, I want to suggest to you that that's a paradox. That's an impossibility. How do you create an institution that's going to... thank you so much, Brian. Thanks so much. Neil, come in. Neil, tell Neil it's okay. Neil, come sit. Come sit. Thanks, guys. That's fine. Come sit. How do you create a container? How do you create an institution to hold God? If God is infinite, if God is transcendent, if God is limitless, in Hebrew, in the Kabbalah, God is called Ein Sof, no end, no limits, no boundaries. If God is boundaryless, how do you create a dwelling place for God in the world? How can you possibly do that? How does that? Well, make it, but like how big, right? Right? Well, but see, this is the question. So what is this going on? I'll just give you a little analogy. Here's a little analogy, right? We have nuclear reactors. There's one in Sen and Nofri, right? Our nuclear reactors carry out a process called nuclear fission. You take a lump of uranium-238 and you subject it to certain forces and it explodes and breaks into smaller molecules. That releases a lot of energy and you can light up Oceanside. If you're a scientist, I know that's very crude, but get the picture, right? The holy grail of nuclear physics is something called nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion is the power that powers the sun. It's the power that powers the stars. Nuclear fusion is where you take two molecules of hydrogen and under certain conditions marry them into one molecule of helium. I get that right? Good. The release of energy in that transaction is so enormous that that's what you get, that's what powers the sun. Hydrogen is coming together and forming helium, right? If you don't contain that transaction, you get the destructive power of a hydrogen bomb. That's what a hydrogen bomb does. A hydrogen bomb carries out this transaction, and the release of energy is so frightening, you can destroy a continent with it. So here's the question. If you were going to harness that energy, you could do anything in the world. You could power the world forever. The question is, here's the only little problem. What kind of container can you create that can hold the energy? You see, build me a bottle. But because the release of energy is so enormous, it is the primary transaction of all physics, because hydrogen is molecule number 1 and helium is molecule number 2. There is no element that you can build a container out of that can hold it. Every element will melt. So that's what nuclear... If you can figure this out, by the way, you could get rather rich.
30 years.
What?
30 years down the line.
Well, the way they're doing it is you don't use an element, you use magnetism. That's how you do it. But then there's an investment of energy into it and a greater expenditure of energy out. So the question is the same question. What kind of container do you create to put God in the world? What kind of container do you put God? Now, I'm going to suggest to you that there are two answers to that question here in the Torah, in the Bible. Answer number 1 is the priestly answer. Answer number 1 is the priestly answer, and the priest's answer is, it has to be done exactly right. No, that's the answer. Create a form which is highly articulated, and that highly articulated form is the place where you put God in the world. So, if you take a look here at the Torah reading, you're going to see this detail. And you're going to scratch your head and say, why are they so concerned about so much? Why don't they just say, build the damn thing? Why so? Look at the next line. Just read with me, just for a sentence or two, just to get a flavor of this, right? They shall make an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. Overlay it with pure gold. Overlay it inside and out, and make a pound of gold molding round about. Cast 4 gold rings, for it shall be attached. Why are you giving me such vervus, Because this is the priestly impulse. The priestly impulse is that the way to create an institution that holds God in the world is to create it with a degree of precision, of exactitude. I'm on page 488. Use the exactitude of ritual to create this institution. We have the same impulse in our culture as well, right? We have a set of art forms that we use to express some of the most powerful passions. Let's take a couple that I know nothing about, so you know more about this than I do, right? Let's take ballet. I know nothing about ballet, so if I get this wrong, you're exactly right. Don't even question it. You're right. What you're trying to do in ballet is express the deepest passions of the human heart. And in order to create a bottle, to create the deepest passions of the human heart, to express the deepest passions of the human heart, you have a highly articulated art form. There is a very, very, very carefully regulated form for how you do ballet. And in fact, I think you could make the case that the more explosive the passions, the more articulated the art form. Right? Shakespeare writes sonnets. Sonnets are really, really hard poems to write. Much easier to write limericks, There once was a guy named Shakespeare, But you can't express passion in a limerick. You can't express passion in a sonnet. You write a symphony. And a symphony has a certain structure of harmonics and a certain structure of musical progression. Think of the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. That I do know a little bit about. I mean, this is the Ode to Joy, right? This is the most explosive, expressive, piece of music in Western culture, trying to capture that feeling of redemption, of just the redemption of the heart, and it's done in a very highly structured form. The priestly impulse is that the more powerful the passion, the more highly structured and articulated the form has to be. So the word that's used over and over again, I'll show you where this word is, because we're going to get a whole book of this. There is at least a half a book, rather. There is a half a book called Leviticus. It's coming up. It's a preview of coming attractions. Right? And take a look on page 585. Once we get the Mishkan up and running, now here's how you use it, says God, right? Vayikra Moshe v'yedaber Adonai elav. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him, right? I'm on 587, from the tent of meeting. Speak to the Israelite people. When any of you present an offering of cattle to the Lord, he shall choose his offering from the herd and the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall make his offering a male without blemish. He shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting. And here's the word I want you to find. Look on page 588, right? And in the second line in the Hebrew, or the second line in the English. In the English it says, for acceptance. In Hebrew it's liratzon. Liratzon. Translation, do it right. Do it right. Now, you don't have to dance ballet. If you don't want to stand on your tippy toes and wear a leotard, that's okay. You can dance any way you want, but you can't call it ballet. Ballet is ballet. It has a way of doing, and if it's going to be ballet, it has to be done a certain way. And there's room for creativity within the rules of ballet. But if you decide you don't want all that restriction, you just want to be free, you call that modern dance. Right? And you can express great emotions in modern dance. Same thing with sonnets. If you don't want to write the sonnet, write free verse. You can write it any way you want. If you don't like the canons of Western representational art, call yourself Jackson Pollock, right? And throw the paint up on the canvas, right? Or Rauschenberg, put a dead coyote in a stick, and you can do that. It's okay. There are revolts against the structure of art forms, right? Of the articulation, right? I'm playing chess with my kid, and he moves a piece, and I say, no, Yona, that doesn't move that way. He looks at me and says, mine does. So, okay, now I get it, all right, But now we're not playing chess anymore. We're playing Yona, right? Okay, but so the point is that so the priestly impulse is create a highly articulated form in order to contain the deep passion of a human being's yearning to commune with God. To create an institution where God and human beings can meet and can share the passions of life, and you're going to create a highly articulated, highly rule-bound, carefully regulated form of doing it. The Torah doesn't say, if you want to tell God how you're feeling today, bring anything you want. It doesn't say that. It's got to be an animal, and it's got to be from the male, and it's got to be 1 year old, and it's got to be without a blemish, and it's got to be brought to the priest. And if you go through this, and if you read Leviticus, it's like a butcher shop, You put your hands over here, and you shecht it this way, and then you take out this part of this part, and the schmaltz and the gewalt, and and then there's a whole vegetarian section, but that's also... No, there is. It's got to be bread, and it's got to be this kind of bread, and it's got to be eaten this way. It's highly articulated. The priestly impulse is, if you're going to meet God, you got to do it right. Because the priest is wrestling with this contradiction. How do you bring God into the world? How do you bring an infinite, limitless, transcendent divinity into the life of finite human beings? It's bringing nuclear fusion into the world. You have to create a bottle. And the bottle are these rules. And the priest is the mediator of the rules. The priest is the mediator of the rules. And this was what was given Moses and in the Torah. And this is what Israel started with. And then the problems began. What's the problem with that? The problem with that you can see right away, is that the more highly articulated the rules are, the more following the rules becomes your obsession, not communing with God. The more the institution becomes the object of your worship, and not what the institution is supposed to stand for.
But that's what God wanted them to do.
Yes, that's according to the priests. And comes along a second group of Jews.
But the priests are
Wait.
God is telling them.
Yeah, no, yes, of course. But then there's another group.
Yes.
Also loudmouth people. As loud as the priests. Right? And much more fun to hang out with. And they were called the prophets. And the prophet shows up and says, "What do you think you're doing?" Now, who's he saying it to? He's not saying it to people who don't care. He's not saying it to people who have ignored what God says. You're exactly correct. He goes to the very people that God told, and the people are doing exactly what God said to do. And they are as obsessed with the laws and rules and regulations as the priests are. And the prophet says, "Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me?" And here is the second voice. If the first voice is the priest voice, who says, here is how you bring God in the world. You create a highly articulated form of communion. The prophet comes along and says, nonsense. That is a problem. Because when you do that, you become obsessed with the rules and you forget what you're trying to do. For the prophet, the only place that you can put God in the world is in the human heart, in devotion, in a selfless life, in a life of justice. And the priest said, This is what you just said. You said it so nicely too, by the way. The priest said, that's what God wants. The prophet says, nonsense. God wants something else. So I brought you some prophetic words. Some of these are already in the Chumash, but I thought I'd put them on one page. So let's enjoy some prophetic words for a minute. I happen to like the prophets. If you didn't get one of the sheets, then look on with somebody who did. And if you're not anywhere near anyone with a sheet, just open your ears and listen. Ready? Prophet number 1 we're going to meet is named Yeshayahu ben Amoz. He lived in the last years, in a generation before the destruction of the temple in the south. He lived in Jerusalem. He was actually a pretty highly placed guy. He, in many ways, was King Hezekiah's national security advisor. Right? You know. And but this is when he was young, before he became such a highly placed guy. And he looks at the temple of Jerusalem, and the temple was like this machine. It was this highly efficient organization for God production, right? And you can, big place, lots of animals coming through, and you're offering all these animal sacrifices. And he stands at the temple. I like to think of him as a kid. I like to think of all the prophets as a kid because there's a certain adolescence to their screaming and yelling. And this is what he says. And just think for a moment how this sounds in the ears of the Jews who heard it first. I once had a kid here. A kid came to me. He's a young man who's an actor, out-of-work actor, but he's an actor. And he said to me, I have this great idea for holidays, Rabbi. I want to put on like a toga and carry a walking stick, wear sandals. And on Yom Kippur, I want to stand in front of the synagogue and I want to quote the words of the prophet. And I want people to hear the outrage of the prophet as they come into the synagogue and remind them that it's not about the form of the ritual, but about the heart. And I said, that's a great idea, except they'll do to you what they did to the prophets. They'll beat you to death with their pocketbooks, And if that's okay with your mom and dad, it's fine with me, right? I just want you to sign a waiver before you do it, right? Because Isaiah didn't have insurance, right? Hear the word of the Lord, you chieftains of Sodom. Give ear to God's instruction, you folk of Gomorrah. Well, that's already going to make an impression, right? Right? What need have I of all your sacrifices, says the Lord? I am sated with burnt offering of rams, the suet of fatlings, the blood of bulls, and I have no delight in lambs and he-goats. That you come and appear before me, who asked that of you? That you're going to hear this over and over again. You hear the same thing in a moment in Jeremiah. He's going to say, who told you to do this? Now the answer is, you, God, you told us. It's in the book of Leviticus in exquisite detail. But the prophet says, no, you didn't understand. It's not about the animal. It's not about the form of the ritual. It's not about doing it obsessively and compulsively, getting it right. It's about something else. It's a turn inward. The only value to the ritual is as an outward symbol of an inward turn of heart. And if the inward turn of heart isn't there, then God doesn't live in the world. Because for the prophet, the line that we just read, Asuli mikdash v'shachanti bitocham. If you want to understand the priests and the prophets, divide it in half. The priests heard the words, Asuli mikdash. So they sat around building a holy institution. The prophets heard the end of the line, v'shachanti bitocham. The whole purpose of this is to place God into the human being, to generate a godly society and godly human beings. And if the energy of the institution is not directed to that, in fact, if the institution becomes an obstacle to that, then the institution becomes dangerous. It's a violation. It's an aberration. It's not a fulfillment of divine will. So he says, I'm sated with the burnt offerings. And he's like, picture God in heaven going, fat, who wants all this meat? Fat, ugh, right? Because you also have to remember, by the way, that they're shechting animals. They're slaughtering and roasting animals. That's the work of the temple. Blah! Maimonides in his, writing 1,000 years later says there were no flies. Because the Talmud says there were 10 miracles in the temple, and one of them where there was no flies. Right? Yeah, sure. I mean, blah, He says that you come before. Who asked that of you? Trample my courts no more. Bringing oblations. Oblation is a fancy word for sacrifice. Is futile. Incense is offensive to me. I mean, these things that you're doing, they're not just not what I asked. They've become you're mocking me. Your gestures of piety become mocking because they're not doing what they're supposed to do. They're not expressing what they're supposed to express. Incense is offensive to me. New moon and Sabbath, those are Rosh Chodesh and Shabbat, those are sacrifices. There was a special Shabbat sacrifice, that's the Musaf, right? And a special Rosh Chodesh, proclaiming of solemnities, assemblies with iniquity, I can't abide. This is God saying, fuck, fat. Your new moons, listen to this, your new moons and fixed seasons fill me with loathing. Like God says, blah, puke, right? They are become a burden to me. I can't endure them. And when you lift up your hands, I will turn my eyes away from you. Now, what does he say? He's not saying you didn't do it right. They did it right. They did all the sacrifices exactly as demanded. They did it right. They carefully brought valuable things. Animals were valuable. He's not condemning them for failing to observe the law. What is he condemning them for? Performing it, but without the intention and without the reverence, the outcome that was supposed to come from it, right? Yes, Douglas, yeah.
So what you've got there is the ritual becoming an end unto itself.
Right, it becomes idolatry, actually.
And then on the other hand, when you throw out all the ritual,
yes,
you get something where you, in effect, throw out the baby with the bathwater, and you lose all the underlying meaning. If you think all the ritual is just bull,
right,
and not there for a purpose,
right, literally bull. By the way, this is I want you to see that. This is the first guy to call ritual bull.
You lose something of who we are.
Yeah, well, now, because look, you can't. You're a married guy. If you go to your wife and say, Brenda, I know it's your birthday, and I love you, and my heart is turned toward you, and you're such a wonderful mother to our children, and a wonderful wife with me, and no gift that I could give you on your birthday could ever express the depths of my heart. So, honey, happy birthday. What's going to happen next?
Enjoy the couch.
Right.
As a place to sleep.
Because human beings need a language in which to express their feelings, and the more powerful their feelings, the more elaborate that language has to be, the more elaborate that bottle has to be, because there's no such thing as free-floating sentiment. It needs an expressive form, and if it's not just a question of expressing the form, but of actually teaching the form generation to generation, you need institutions. Right? Every yontif, I get the kid who comes to me and says, Rabbi, I don't want to come to synagogue and pray on the holiday. I want to go to the top of the mountain. I want to go to Malibu and sit up there by the beach and pray. I always say, take me with you. Take me with you. I don't want to be here either. I don't put on the damn robe and lead these people in prayer. I want to sit up there in Malibu. And you know what we'll do? We'll sit there for 10 minutes thinking of God, and then some beautiful woman in a bikini is going to walk by, and both of us will go, oh my God, me more than you, and suddenly we're going to forget that we're there to do tshuva, because that's the way the human heart works, especially the male human heart, right? Right? I hear music coming, right at the right moment too, right? So here's the question, and then there's we don't need the argument. We don't need institutions. The argument that we don't need institutions. We don't need institutions because the feelings just well up in our hearts. That's true. We only need institutions the moment you want to actually say so to another person. You want to share with another person, right? You remember this? Some of you remember there used to be a radio program. Dennis Prager was actually the moderator called Religion on the Line. Remember that? KABC was on Sunday nights around 10 o'clock, and I'd be driving home from somewhere, and I get to listen. And it was a priest, a rabbi, and a minister, and Dennis, right? Right? And what would happen is... What?
Joe Potasnik.
Who's Joe Potasnik?
He's the head of the New York Board of Rabbis.
So this was local. You had yours. In New York, you had the same thing, right? And every week, somebody would call in with the same question. I'd like to know from the panel, if I'm not part of a church or a synagogue, can I still have a relationship with God? Do you need religion to have a relationship with God, right? And what would always happen is the Catholic priest, who believes you do, would say, yes, my son, through the church one comes close to the Lord, right? And the Protestant minister would say, no, you don't. You can have your heart is turned toward the Lord. That's all that matters. And the rabbi would always say, isn't it time for a commercial now? But here's the answer. The answer is, you don't need religion to have a relationship with God. You really don't. You can have a very powerful communion with God, with divinity, without the benefit of religion. The problem starts the first time you want to tell somebody about it. The first time you want to express to somebody what just happened to you. And you need a language in which to express what just happened to you. That language is the birth of religion. And then if you want to say, I have to go to work on Monday, but I don't want to forget what happened to me on Saturday. So I create a sort of language for capturing the experience and preserving it and revisiting it from time to time. And if I want to share it with the ones who are dear to me so that they can follow my path and arrive at a similar sense of communion with the divine, and that's the birth of religion, you see? So you're exactly right. The problem is, on the one hand, you need form. And on the other hand, form tends to become an idol. And this is the debate between the priest and the prophet. And this is it's endemic, it's inherent in the creation of any religious institution. So the philosopher Martin Buber wrote that any religion and any religious institution always has to be in upheaval. He'd love VBS, right? It always has to be in upheaval because you have to have both impulses working against each other at all times. The impulse to settle into form and the impulse to overthrow form and seek a pure, formless kind of communion. And this is the dynamic, the dialectic of religious creativity. And religion dies when either side of the paradox wins. Because if form wins, you end up with idolatry. And if formlessness wins, you end up with anarchy. You see? And so here's the voice of upheaval. Ready? So come with me back here, ready? He says, and when you lift up your hands, I will turn my eyes away from you. Though you pray at length, I will not listen. Your hands are stained with crime. Now this is a different claim now. His claim is, were you truly in communion with God, you would be working to create a just society. You can't turn your back on an unjust society and turn your eyes toward God. That's a contradiction. That's a contradiction. Your hands are stained with crime. Wash yourselves clean. Put away your evil doings away from my sight. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Devote yourselves to justice. Aid the wrong. Uplift the rights of the orphan. Defend the cause of the widow. So those of you who always write me these angry letters about why do you always bring politics, I just want you to sit down, not the first. Maybe the second, but not the first, right? And orphans, widows, there it is, right? Right? Doesn't say anything about health care or refugees, but that's coming. That's coming in the next paragraph, right?
Doesn't say to do it through government either.
That's right. Right. Come, let us reach an understanding, says the Lord, which is a really interesting idea. Let us reach. God says, like this. You'll see that he's much more reasonable than Jeremiah. You know, who's coming next? Let's talk. You know, God says, no. Let's have a coffee and talk, right? Be your sins like crimson, they can turn snow white. Be they red as dyed wool, they can become like fleece. If then you agree and give heed, you will eat the good things of the earth. This is classic biblical prophecy. Judith.
I was wondering, how did the ultra-Orthodox feel about Isaiah?
How do they feel about Isaiah?
How do they think?
They're pro-Isaiah. They,
And do not, it
Moshiach.
really caught up with that, because the ritual takes over some of the things that I hear.
you think? Yeah. You think maybe?
I've been exposed to.
Yeah. Yeah. I think they probably read it differently than I do.
Conservative rabbis read it like that.
No, I don't think conservative rabbis read it like that. I think, yeah. I think people who really understand what he's getting at, people like me, understand that religion at heart has to have this upheaval. And that upheaval is not a mistake, and it's not sinful, right? The adolescent kid who comes to me before Rosh Hashanah and says, Rabbi, I don't want to come to shul, I want to go sit on a mountain in Malibu and meditate, I welcome that. I mean, I really make that kid feel at home, because first of all, I resonate with it. It's a big part of me that's with him. But because part of it is, that's the impulse. He's got the impulse. He doesn't know the history of his impulse, nor does he know what the consequences of going all the way to one side or the. He doesn't know that, but the impulse is the right impulse. So that kid has to be embraced. That kid has to be supported. That kid has to be taught, and that's exactly the right impulse, right? When we were kids and we used to complain to the rabbi that services were boring, and the rabbi, yelled at us because we were being sacrilegious. That's wrong. The kid who says services are boring is asking for a higher quality of religious experience. That's sacred. That's the prophetic voice. Don't lose that voice. The community needs the energy of that voice. Because the moment that everybody sits in shul really quietly and says, Amen, is the death of religion. This has to, the upheaval, the creative upheaval of religion. Because what then happens is, generation to generation, the newly created expression then settles into its own form of standard orthodoxy. And then the next generation has to overturn it, right? Last week, some of you were here with Cantor Mizrahi, and he demonstrated this, right? Every melody that you associate as the standard Jewish melodies was once a revolution, right? Every time Rav Cantor Barron changes a melody, someone comes and complains to me bitter. Why don't you just leave the traditional melodies? I say, when was that melody written? He says, I don't know, it's the traditional melody. I say, if I told you that melody was written 100 years ago and it was considered obscene when it was created, would that scare you? I mean, you understand that the music is, the creative upheaval is part of the process, you see? Because what you're trying to do is essentially impossible. You're trying to squeeze God into a building. You're trying to squeeze God into an institution. How does God define God's self, God himself? When Moses asks him at the burning bush, I'll make you find this, but it's too many pages. Moses says to God, when I go to the people of Israel, they're going to ask me, what's your name? Nu, what's your name? And what does God say? Does God say, my name is Bob? That's what I would, if I was writing the Bible, that's what I would. God said, hello, call me Bob, That would have been so much easier. Call me Zeus. Call me Jupiter. Call me Thor or Wooden. Call me John Wooden. Call me that. But what does God say? God, the answer in the Bible at that point is so frustrating. It's so frustrating. It's so frustrating. If you read that page, I can show it to you in here. If you read that page in the JPS Chumash, Dr. Ginsburg, who translated it, didn't translate it. He wrote it into the English translation, the Hebrew words, which means, I don't know what it means, right? And the word is what? Ehiyeh. Ehiyeh, asher ehiyeh. What does ehiyeh, asher ehiyeh mean? I will be what I will be, right? Or as Popeye once said, I am that I am, right? Okay? What does that even mean? And then he says, call me ehiyeh. What does that mean? That means you can't define me. You can't name me. Because to name something means to put a circle around it and say, that's it, but it's not over there. You can't do that. The divine is by nature transcendent, limitless, always pushing out the limit. Now, how do you take that God, squeeze him into a building? Squeeze him into an institutional set of religious rules and laws. That's what the priests tried to do. Priests said, we can do it because we know how to do it because God showed us how to do it. We have the formula. Prophet said, no, you don't. Nobody does. I mean, you see the problem here? You see the problem? You know, so Douglas is going to buy his wife a birthday present, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And he's going to give it to his wife, and he's still going to say to her, honey, I bought this for you. I hope you love it. And she's going to say, it's beautiful. And he's going to then say, but it doesn't capture how special you are to me and to our children.
And then she's gonna take it back and go get something.
Because it says in the book of Leviticus, leave the receipt in the box. Leave the receipt in the box so she can get what she wants, right? Right? You know, this is, you didn't know you were getting marriage counseling in front of the Yeah. It's the guy who brought his wife a vacuum cleaner for her birthday. You ever see that? It's like, you know, like, you talk about a cold couch, you know. All right, let's take another prophet, shall we? You ready? Jeremiah. Who is Jeremiah? Jeremiah is not the bullfrog. Jeremiah was commissioned to be a prophet 40 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. He's living in the southern kingdom. 40 years before the destruction of Jerusalem, he becomes a prophet. He's a young man. According to the Bible, he was 17 years old. So he really is an adolescent. He is watching the coming of the destruction, right? He sees the destruction coming. I have a theory about this, and I have a theory about this that's based on him and also on Theodore Herzl. There is a curious line late in the book of Jeremiah, after the destruction. He witnesses the destruction of Jerusalem, and then he's there in Jerusalem to comfort those who were being exiled. And there's a strange line right at that point in the book that says, at last I can get a good night's sleep. And I wondered about that. And I have a theory. Theodore Herzl, you all know Theodore Herzl. So in 1897, Theodore Herzl organizes the first Zionist Congress. Herzl also has these curious lines in his diary about nightmares he had. I think Herzl, and Herzl's a strange man because from 1896 until his death in 1904, he basically works himself to death, literally works himself to death. He had a terrible heart condition to begin with, but he's traveling, he's speaking, he's touring, he's raising money. He just works himself to death. The question is, what's driving this man? Before this, he was never that serious a guy. He was a schwach playwright. He wrote light pieces for the newspaper. He wrote travel pieces for the newspaper, right? And suddenly he becomes this prophet of the Jewish people. And there's this interesting way of looking at it, that Herzl went to sleep the night of the Dreyfus trial in France, and he saw Auschwitz in his nightmares. I know this sounds like the Twilight Zone. I know that some of you were so young you don't know what I just said, but you remember the Twilight Zone? Of course. All right, so imagine a man who goes to sleep and every night he has the same nightmare for years. And the nightmare is he's in a barracks in Auschwitz. What would he do? He would become Theodore Herzl. I think the same thing happened to Jeremiah. I think Jeremiah goes to sleep in his 17th year, and in his sleep he sees the destruction of Jerusalem. He sees the decimation of its population, the murder of the priests, the tearing down of the temple, everything precious to him, everything that's sacred to him, everything that means anything to him, that defines him, is in his nightmares he sees dissolve, and he becomes obsessed. That would explain the prophet. Prophecy is not that God puts words in your mouth. Prophecy is this ability to see what's coming unless you can change the course of history. So here this 17-year-old guy goes to the Holy Temple of Jerusalem. I like to imagine he goes Rosh Hashanah, right? And here's what God tells him to do. The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord, Stand at the gates of the house of the Lord and there proclaim the word. Hear the word of the Lord, all you of Judah who enter these gates to worship the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, God of Israel, mend your ways and your actions, and I will let you dwell in this place. Let you dwell. Now remember, what was the commandment in the Torah? Asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. Create for me the holy place so that I may dwell within you. God knows what he wrote in Exodus. And he says to Jeremiah, it's no longer a question of you creating a place for me. It's now a question of whether I wish to tolerate you in my place. I'm not sure I want to tolerate you in my place. I will let you dwell. I will let you dwell. This is an image of a God of history who is exquisitely active, right? Don't put your trust in illusions. Now, what he's referring to is that 130 years earlier, the Assyrian army, Ashur, the Assyrians, came down from Nineveh, across the Fertile Crescent, smashed the northern kingdom of Israel, and exiled all of its leadership, and then came to Jerusalem, and they besieged the city of Jerusalem, and they demanded of the king that he surrender the temple and surrender the city. And the king went to the prophet Isaiah, and he said, what the hell do I do? Do I fight against the Assyrians? Do I surrender? Either way I lose. What do I do? And Isaiah gave him some really interesting advice. Isaiah said, do nothing. And Hezekiah said, pardon me? What did you just say? And Isaiah said, do nothing. Nothing's going to happen. And Hezekiah said, what do you mean, like, do nothing? They're going to kill us all. No. Just trust me on this. Do nothing. So the king went home and he thought about this for a night. And he went to bed with 50,000 Assyrians in his front yard. And he woke up and they were gone. They were gone. Now the Bible says that God sent a plague among them and scared them away. The archaeologists tell us that there was a coup d'etat back in Assyria, and the son of the king seized the throne, so the king pulled his army out of Judea and went back to Assyria to reclaim his throne. Either way, in the morning, Hezekiah calls up Isaiah and said, how did you know? And Isaiah said, that's why they call me prophet, Boychik, you know? Right? So what happens is you have an ideology which starts to rise in Jerusalem, which says, we are exempt. The forces of history don't touch us. Nothing can happen to us. We are God's people. This is God's city. That's God's house. God lives in that house. Nothing can happen to us. After all, the Assyrians destroyed everything else, but they didn't destroy that. They didn't destroy our temple. They didn't destroy our city. They didn't destroy us. We are exempt from the forces of history. 130 years later, the prophet Isaiah shows up, the prophet Jeremiah shows up and says, listen, don't put your trust in illusions and say, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these buildings. This exemption, you don't have an exemption. You got lucky once, right? No, if you really mend your ways and your actions, if you execute justice between one man and another, if you do not oppress the stranger, the orphan, the widow, if you do not shed the blood of the innocent in this place, if you do not follow other gods you unheard, then only will I let you dwell in this place, the land that I gave your fathers for all time. The covenant you have with God is a conditional covenant. And your residence in this land is conditional. Conditioned upon what? The priest would say, the careful observance of Leviticus, the sacrifices. The prophet says, nonsense. It's conditional upon moral aspiration. An infinite God, a transcendent God, demands that you rise above the natural level of your humanity. Translation. Every urban society has a certain amount of evil which we come to accept. I'll be right with you. I'm on a roll here. Every urban society has a certain a quantity and quality of evil which we ignore, right? There are 45,000 homeless people living on the streets of LA. Yes, we are. They're still there. There's a ballot measure. We'll see what happens. I mean, but they're there. They're going. They're growing. There are more of them. The schools of this city are dilapidated in certain neighborhoods, but we don't have to notice that because they build freeways over those neighborhoods. There's a certain quality of evil, and we come to appreciate. We come to accept it. It's the way things are. It's the way I was in. Anyone ever been to Brazil? I went to Sao Paulo. I gave some lectures in Sao Paulo. Beautiful in Rio. Beautiful. They have a beautiful JCC in Rio, in Sao Paulo. It's guarded by, if I'm not exaggerating, there's 2 barbed wire fences before you could get to the JCC. Anyone ever gone to shul in Europe? Yes. Yeah, and you know what's in front of the shul? The guy with a machine gun. You think our guards are mean and scary looking? But you come to.
They're nice. They're nice.
You come to accept this as part of the sort of flow of events, right? So what Jeremiah is saying is, wake up, look at it. Don't turn your eyes away from it. Look at it, yeah. Look at it. Pay attention to this, because this is what bothers God. What bothers God is not, outrageous evil. You're all good people. You live nice lives. But to live in a society, within an urban society, is to live with it, to become tolerant of a certain quantity of evil. And that's what he's worried about. Mark.
You were on the roll.
Yeah, I'm having fun.
Brilliant and
Yeah, all right.
there's really nothing to say against it.
Except, well, there's a qualification, but.
The problem is,
Yeah,
first of all,
yeah,
the prophetic voice cannot be contained, and after Ezra, it's eliminated. So one could say, however great it is, however necessary it is,
yeah,
and I don't think anyone has ever made a better case than you made today about the upheaval in religion.
right.
The truth is, it cannot be tolerated.
Mhm.
And except for a Meshuggah kid who comes to you before Yontif, the truth is it's over. It's over, it isn't tolerated, it isn't included. If someone says they're a prophet, they are to be rejected.
Yeah,
The priests win. The priests win. The priestly voice wins. The problem is the second one, and to give a name to both the problems of the priestly voice and the prophetic voice, the problem of the priestly voice is Paul, and the problem of the prophetic voice is Jeremiah. Paul says, look, I just want to do Jewish law exactly right so I can be redeemed.
right.
But there's 613 commandments. I can't do them all, and I'm not going to be saved. And then he has the experience somehow, some way on the road to Damascus, and that leads to the place across the street. So he's saying, the law taught me sin.
Yeah, right.
So the priestly voice dies because you can't do the law.
Okay.
The prophetic voice dies because you cannot be righteous in a public square. You cannot be righteous enough to satisfy God. So in the end, the only choice we really have, I can say this now that I'm retired, and it doesn't matter. The only choice we have
Yeah.
is Malibu. But you were good today. And no one can take that away from you.
If the joke is Malibu, what are you doing here?
I'm on my way to Mountain.
It's funny because I thought you were going to say, up until the last word, which was a very good word, I thought you were going to say something different. I thought you were going to say that the rabbinic tradition tries to resolve it, because the rabbis try to legislate prophecy, to create a different bottle. They create a different bottle for divinity. That'll be another. We can't do that.
Period, yes.
Yeah, we can't do
Get
that.
it ossified as well.
Okay. Yes, please, David.
So, going back to what you were saying before with God, really, since God can't be fully contained in any one place, but it can be partly there, it implies that God and religion and ultimately what we're all striving for is in the world every day, everywhere. It's the balance of all of these things.
So I'm gonna. You're exactly right.
Stop there.
Fair enough. Yeah. Sandy. I'm in a good mood today, so go ahead.
Wasn't the Baal Shem Tov, wasn't that a rebel,
Ask him. Don't ask me. He's the one that said.
Yeah, that worked for 2 generations.
They tried to solve it.
And
Yeah,
now
but-
it's Chabad. So
Yeah.
tell me where that
But no, but that's exactly the point. She's right. That's the point. It can only last a generation or two, and then it becomes co-opted by the priestly voice, by the form, right? So then it rises again in some other form, right?
I'll tell you.
Then it rises in the Reform movement.
No, please.
No, it does. And then that has its own orthodoxy.
But Rabbi,
Go ahead.
My granddaughter goes to Wisconsin, the University of Wisconsin, and there's
I went there too.
They love it. They go to Chabad. They go for the chicken soup and the rabbi. And
Yeah.
They go to Chabad.
No.
So it's not. It's still there.
Yeah. Okay. David.
Is it possible that the answer is the dialectic struggle?
Well, that's what I tried to indicate. And Rabbi Gelman argues that the dialectic can't hold.
No.
And you end up always slipping back into the priest's worship of form. Right?
But there's movement, you either move forward or you move back.
Well, this movement, yeah. So this movement plus this, but yeah, you're right. This movement, and I'm going to suggest to the good rabbi that while you can suppress that prophetic voice, it always finds its way back. Gershon.
It cannot find its way back in a religious.
Oh, you're right. Exactly. Right, and no question.
It could be Leonard Cohen. It could be.
Well, that's sort of religious to me, so, So what happens is, it's the sort of magma of religious life that's going to find a crack in the orthodoxy and force its way back up. It'll always be in a different form, which is why you got to be looking out for it in each generation, because it's going to show up in a different way. And when it happens, you embrace it. You don't try to destroy it. Religion's first impulse is to destroy it. Shut up, kid. Put on your suit and come to shul. To say to the kid, no, you know what, maybe we should all go out to Malibu. It's like, that'll scare the hell out of the kid, by the way. What, my parents with me, Yeah, how can I say it? Yeah,
I was going to say, I really do believe it is about the eternal struggle, because we're still here.
Yeah.
So clearly, we have orthodoxy, again, orthodoxy isn't a monolith, we have Hasidism, we have orthodoxy, we have conservative, we have reform, and it just
Yeah.
keeps going.
Yeah.
But everybody has their doctrine, and we're all still.
we're still fighting this thing. By the way, just in terms of orthodoxy, if you want to look up the paper last week, 2 weeks ago, last week, the Orthodox Union, the guys who put their hechsher on all the food, published a very important statement and a tshuva prohibiting women from holding clergy roles in Orthodox synagogues. And then Rabbi Weiss, who was here, and Rabbi Kanevsky, who was in LA, wrote the responses. So if you want to see my religious magma forcing its way through the cracks in orthodoxy, just read that dialogue. It is remarkable. It is to know that you live to see Orthodox rabbis fighting over whether women can serve as rabbis. You say a shechianu, right? Who would have imagined, right? Who would have imagined? Yes.
For me, part of the answer is moment by moment, the choices that we make. But it's only where your feet are right this second.
Yeah.
Cliches.
Yeah. Yeah. I got it. You got to listen to the voices and decide. But I'm going to argue another one, which we don't have time now. But that this was the paradox that the rabbis tried to take up with the way that they did halakha, and that's a whole other kind of talk. So let's stop here because it's a good time to stop. I want you to go meditate on these two voices. Listen for the prophetic voice and the priestly voice in your own life. Come listen to the mayor's voice and to Ambassador Corin, and we'll see each other next week. Have a good Shabbos.